Good evening beyond the quiet. I prefer not to say my name because many people who know me already think I've gone crazy after what happened that night. But I decided to send this account because what I experienced still haunts me, and perhaps someone out there will be able to believe what I've never been able to prove. What I can say is that night on I-40, something followed me for almost 10 minutes. Something that had no headlights, no engine, and yet managed to keep up with my truck as if it were glued to my rear. And when I finally looked in the rearview mirror, I realized that it wasn't a vehicle. I've been driving this highway for years, crossing states night after night, and I know how to recognize when something doesn't fit the road's pattern. There are noises you learn to identify from afar, brake lights you know will come on even before the other driver decides to stop. Smells of burning, brakes, oil, that are part of everyday life. But that early morning, it wasn't any of that. It was as if the very emptiness behind me had decided to gain weight, texture, and intention. The trip had started normally. I had left Flagstaff with a full tank, the paperwork in order, and a comfortable estimated delivery time to Little Rock. It was the kind of route I knew like the back of my hand, a long stretch of I-40 that many people consider monotonous, but which, for those who depend on the road, represents money, routine, and sometimes a strange kind of comfort. The night was clear, the sky open, the temperature low enough that the air entering through the cracks in the cabin seemed more like a warning that outside, the world continued on indifferent to everything. That's when the first signs began that this trip wouldn't end like any other. The radio started malfunctioning in a different way. It wasn't the irregular static of someone losing signal. It was a continuous hiss at an almost painful frequency that seemed to cut through the air in thin lines. I fiddled with the dial, changed stations, turned it off and on again. Nothing helped. The interference continued, persistent, as if it were stuck to the cabin and not the device. After listening to that for a few minutes, I realized my shoulders had tensed up without me noticing. My head began to feel heavy, not from sleepiness, but from a kind of internal pressure, as if something was sucking the calm from within me. I looked in the rearview mirror more out of habit than concern, and the first thing I felt was strangeness, not fear. It seemed that the darkness behind the truck wasn't uniform. There was an area a few meters behind the trailer where the darkness seemed denser, more compact, as if it had thickness. At first, I forced logic. I told myself it could be an optical illusion, fatigue, some strange reflection from the dashboard in the window, anything like that. The brain clings to comfortable explanations before accepting what doesn't make sense. So I took a deep breath, adjusted my posture in the seat, and refocused on the yellowish line dividing the lanes. The engine responded well. The load was stable. Nothing indicated a mechanical problem. Still, the feeling that something was wrong remained there, firm, like a weight resting on the pit of my stomach. A few miles later, the radio interference grew louder, as if someone had turned an invisible knob, increasing the frequency. Every second, the hissing seemed to try to organize itself into something resembling a voice, but it never quite got there. It was like the sound of someone trying to speak underwater, but unable to break through the surface. I reached out, turned the radio off completely, and unplugged the cable from the dashboard, as if that could silence whatever was playing with that noise. The hissing continued for a few more seconds, lingering in the air, until it disappeared altogether, leaving an even heavier silence than before. It was in that silence that the entire truck trembled in a strange way. It wasn't the vibration from bad asphalt. It wasn't a crosswind. It wasn't a pothole in the road. It was a short vibration, as if someone had given the rear a slight push. I instinctively looked at the dashboard, expecting to see some kind of fault warning or a sudden change in pressure, but all the indicators remained within normal limits. Even so, I knew I hadn't imagined that push. The sensation had been physical, real, like someone touching your back when you're distracted. I glanced back at the rearview mirror, and this time, I didn't need much effort to see. That patch of dense darkness behind the truck had drawn closer. I couldn't make out a defined outline. I couldn't tell where it began or ended, but there was a mass there, a presence. It moved along with the truck, maintaining the same distance, adjusting its position precisely as I accelerated or eased off the accelerator. It wasn't a projected shadow. It was something that sustained itself, as if the darkness had decided to take on a shape. I decided to test it, more out of trucker instinct than courage. I pressed the accelerator a little harder, making the speedometer needle gradually climb. The engine responded with that deep rumble I knew so well, and the scenery outside began to pass by a little faster. The presence behind me didn't lag behind. It kept pace with the increase in speed with an impossible ease. There were no headlights, no metallic glare, nothing to indicate that it was a physical vehicle. It was just that compacted block of night sliding in the vacuum of my wake. My heart began to beat faster, and my breathing involuntarily became shorter. I couldn't find an acceptable explanation. Anything material would have shown some sign, emitted light, raised dust, reflected the slightest glare from the headlights. But not that. It just existed, stuck to my path, as if it were bound to my trajectory and not to the road. The worst part was when I felt the light touch on the back of the trailer again. It wasn't an impact. It wasn't a collision. It was a kind of contact, as if something had touched me without weight but with presence. Along with that sensation, a fraction of a second later, I saw the power gauge fluctuate on the dashboard, as if the entire electrical system had been startled. The interior lights flickered very slightly, almost imperceptibly, and I understood that whatever was behind me wasn't just following me. It was interacting with the truck. I started making micro-corrections to the lane, veering the truck a few centimeters to the right, then to the left as if I wanted to detach it from me. It was like trying to get rid of an obsessive thought by changing the subject. In one of these corrections, the late crosswind hit the side of the trailer, making the whole thing sway. Under normal conditions, this would have irritated me a little, but that would have been all. In that context, it felt like something had taken advantage of that movement to get even closer. In the rearview mirror, the compacted darkness now seemed glued to the edge of the trailer. It wasn't a static view. I perceived a kind of internal movement in that dark mass, as if something were stirring within it, testing its own forms, searching for a way to structure itself. It was like looking at smoke frozen in slow motion, trying to solidify and failing all the time. I knew I couldn't just brake in the middle of I-40. Even on a deserted night, any sudden maneuver could mean losing control. So I tried something else. I started to slow down gradually, as if I were preparing to pull into a gas station ahead, even without seeing one. The truck slowed down, and as I had expected and feared, its presence slowed down along with it, in perfect synchronicity. There was no delay, no difference in pace. It was as if it were coupled to my speed, attached to me by some kind of invisible hook. That's when the fear stopped being just mental and descended into my body for real. My hands sweated, the steering wheel became damp, and I felt a tingling sensation rise from the base of my spine to the nape of my neck. The atmosphere inside the cabin seemed to have suddenly gotten colder, but the air coming in through the cracks didn't justify that change. It was a different kind of cold, heavy, the kind of sensation that usually accompanies the realization that someone is behind you in a place where there should only be emptiness. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I knew that if I let it continue, at some point that thing would cross a line. It would go from presence to invasion, and I wasn't willing to find out what came next. I glanced quickly at the shoulder, which in that stretch was wide enough for a truck to stop with relative safety. I made a decision that any instructor would condemn. I firmly pulled the steering wheel to the right, downshifted harder than I should have, and threw the vehicle onto the shoulder in an almost continuous motion. The truck responded with mechanical protests, swaying, letting out that heavy brake groan, while the rear end oscillated a few centimeters from side to side. Throughout this process, I kept my eyes alternating between the road and the rearview mirror. The dark mass hesitated. For a fraction of a second, it seemed unsure how to react to that change in pattern. It swayed along with the trailer, as if pulled by wires attached to the bodywork, and then retreated a few meters, still in the darkness, as if assessing from the outside what to do. When the truck finally stopped, albeit somewhat negligibly, with slight vibrations echoing throughout the structure, I remained motionless. I didn't turn off the engine, I didn't let go of the steering wheel, I didn't turn on any lights inside the cab. I just stood there, breathing heavily, listening to my own heart pounding in my head, waiting for the presence to make its decision. When I was sure I couldn't see anything but the usual darkness, I waited. The clock on the dashboard showed 10 minutes since the stop, but to me it felt like half an hour. I only managed to get the truck back on the road when I felt the air inside the cab had returned to its proper weight, without that strange density that was crushing me from the inside. The truth is, since that early morning, I've never again seen the darkness of the road as something neutral. Whenever I pass through very empty stretches, especially that section between New Mexico and Texas, I feel my body go into a state of alert, even if my mind tries to pretend everything is fine. I look in the rearview mirror more times than I should, even when I know there are no headlights behind me. It's as if a part of me has remained trapped on that trip, eternally waiting for the moment when the darkness will decide to take shape again and silently touch the bumper. It was something that found a convenient target in me for a few kilometers, tested how close it could get, played with the truck's electrical system, weighed down the air around me, and then left when it decided it had done enough. I just hope that if it's looking for another driver, the next one doesn't ignore the feeling of being followed when there are no headlights in the rearview mirror, because maybe that's the only chance to stop in time and not end up like me, standing in the dark, trying to convince himself that he's still sane. If you're enjoying these chilling stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any more terrifying tales to come. Now, get ready for another journey down dark and mysterious roads. I started the engine in the yard of a warehouse in Laredo near the border, already with that feeling that the freight was going wrong. It wasn't just the rush of a shipper at the end of their shift. It was a calculated look on top of my refrigerated truck, as if everyone there knew there was too much hidden in that white container. The manifest said it was frozen meat for supermarkets in Dallas, but the way they surrounded my truck made it clear that the real money wouldn't come from what was on the invoice. A man in an orange vest, without a name tag, circled the truck without looking at the tires, without touching the hoses, without asking any technical questions. He just walked around, measuring distances. Another stood behind the trailer, attentive to the locks, the bars, the roof. A third was on the phone the whole time, always keeping an eye on me. When they brought the tablet for me to sign, the route wasn't the same one the broker had sent. Heavier weight, detour via state highway, stop at a nameless logistics depot on the side of I-35. I questioned it. The supervisor mumbled that it was an internal adjustment and that I would be paid for extra miles. He didn't maintain even half a second of eye contact. I felt the thud of the load on the frozen floor and knew they had mixed too much stuff in there. The thermograph showed a stable temperature, but the noises were too dense for a pallet of meat. I could have refused at that moment. But overdue financing, expensive diesel, and a repair shop waiting to be paid don't mix well with refusing a freight that pays above the standard rate. I signed the manifest, engaged the gear, and let the warehouse gate disappear in the mirror, knowing that, from then on, any inspection stop had the potential to end my career. Night fell quickly in the Texas countryside. The constant hum of the refrigerated unit behind the cab, which usually fades with time, seemed like a reminder on that trip that someone had rented my truck and my social security number to transport something they didn't want to show up in the system. I drove the first few hours in a straight line, with only the headlights of family cars, motorhomes, and a few familiar highway trucks. Nothing strange. Until, near Waco, a silver pickup truck started repeating the same pattern. She would appear in the rearview mirror, always maintaining the same distance and never attempting to overtake. When I stopped to refuel, she would continue on and disappear. As soon as I returned to the highway, there she was again, positioned exactly in the same spot. Patient vigilance without exaggeration. At the first gas station, I got out pretending to be routine, checked the seal, saw the padlock was intact, the thermal imager was normal. A young man in a cap leaning against the convenience store quickly looked away when I approached the rear. I didn't start a conversation. A driver who realizes he's being used learns not to engage in conversation with strangers. I maintained a constant speed, changing lanes more than strictly necessary. The greater the suspicion, the more important it is to appear predictable. The pickup truck remained behind like an official shadow. When I left the interstate to take the detour indicated in the manifest, the road became narrow, poorly lit, with old signs and a shoulder too short for a safe stop. The GPS pointed to a depot a few miles away with no town nearby, no gas station, Nothing. The kind of place that doesn't appear in any trucking company's advertisement. The depot appeared as a gray blur in the darkness. A low warehouse, 2 rusty containers, some abandoned trailers. No company sign, no gate, almost no lights. I pulled over where the GPS indicated. The silver pickup truck stopped sideways, with a perfect view of the back of the trailer. Nobody got out. No doors opened, no radios called. The silence there was so dense that only the compressor of the refrigerated unit filled the air. I got out, walked to the side door of the warehouse, and found the padlock only fitted, not locked. I pushed it. Inside, only darkness and a floor marked by old tires. No recent pallets, no forklifts. That place hadn't received a load in a long time. I went back to the truck with a heavy stomach. That's when I heard from inside the trailer a different noise, a mixture of impact and sliding metal, too displaced to be just a box of meat. I unlocked the padlock, pulled the door, and the icy blast hit me like a punch. Boxes of meat were stacked in front just right. But further back, I noticed a step where there shouldn't be one. There was a false floor, supported by recently installed metal bars creating a lower compartment. Above, a few generic plastic boxes. Below, low containers lined up like morgue drawers, each with a side vent and handwritten numbering. The ink drained by the cold. I brought my face close to a vent and heard an almost imperceptible, constant hum, unlike that of a motor or ventilation system. 2 containers had frozen stains on the metal, remnants of some liquid that had spilled before hardening. I touched them with my fingertips and withdrew my hand in the same second. The cold there wasn't just room temperature. It was as if the metal held something aggressive, kept under control by force. It didn't make sense as drugs, nor as a disassembled weapon. Everything pointed to high-risk biological material, some research that couldn't travel by plane or appear in official records. I closed the door, locked it again, took a deep breath, and felt a faint chemical smell clinging to my throat. If that were discovered in a random raid, my name would go from being a bank debtor to a federal investigation file overnight. Whoever sets up a scheme like that isn't a border amateur. They're people with structure, contacts, and a habit of taking down drivers who decide to improvise morality mid-trip. The high beams of the silver pickup truck flashed, blinding me for a few seconds. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust. Then the headlights dimmed. The door opened. A man got out, a hood covering half his face, his hands seemingly empty. He wasn't carrying a weapon in plain sight. He didn't speak loudly. He just pointed his chin towards the back of the truck and watched me. He didn't need to say anything. The message was entirely in that gesture. They knew I had seen, and they wanted to know what I would do with that information. I climbed back into the cab without answering. I engaged the gear and slowly drove off, returning to the state highway. The pickup truck followed behind for a few minutes, maintaining the same distance, until it disappeared down a dirt road. They left the choice in my lap. If I completed the protest route, I would be a silent accomplice. If I sought out the wrong authority, I could disappear before anyone recorded my name. The road doesn't teach ready-made answers for this kind of intersection. It only teaches you to assess risks. I drove for hours without music, without a radio, just the noise of the engine filling the cabin. The clearer the sky got, the clearer it became that I couldn't just deliver the cargo to the final address and pretend I hadn't seen anything. Nor could I walk into any county police station with that truck and expect to be treated like a hero. Anyone who arrives with too big a problem at the wrong door ends up becoming part of the statistics that nobody reads. When a large meatpacking plant appeared by the side of the highway, with high fences, cameras everywhere, and signs advertising partnerships with state agencies, I understood that this was my safety zone. I entered as if following normal procedures, parked in one of the designated areas, looked for the manager on duty, and showed him the delivery manifest. I explained that the system had redirected the delivery, and that I needed to confirm if there was any scheduled unloading there. He checked the computer, saw that there was no scheduled delivery for my license plate, and frowned. I calmly asked if he could contact the health inspectors to prevent me from driving around carrying potentially irregular merchandise. A few hours later, official pickup trucks pulled up to the yard. Inspectors got out with clipboards and identifying vests. We climbed up together to the back of the truck. They broke the seal, recorded the number, and photographed the position of the boxes. When they noticed the difference in depth in the floor, they called for tools, removed part of the false floor, and exposed the hidden compartment. The aligned containers appeared to everyone at the same time. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, just quick glances between the inspectors, short phone calls, technical terms I didn't know. They asked me to stay in the office waiting room without leaving the building. From the window, I saw the refrigeration unit being turned off under their instructions and more patrol cars arriving. One of the federal agents took over the case and came to talk to me at the end of the day. He asked about the shipper, who brokered the freight, about the silver pickup truck. I answered everything without trying to whitewash myself too much. I talked about the above-average payment, the overdue installments, the route deviation. I handed over my message history, let them search the entire cabin. The interrogation lasted for hours. In the end, I signed a stack of statements and heard the phrase that drivers in this situation rarely hear. I could leave, but I would remain available. I left there without a truck. The tractor and trailer were impounded for inspection. For months, I drove around in a rented vehicle, taking small freight jobs to survive while my name circulated in reports I won't read. My license plate ended up in a database. My photo was attached to folders that travel through departments with too many acronyms. There was no arrest, but there was no forgetting either. Today, when a transport company offers an excessively high price for a route with an unknown depot in the middle of nowhere, I recognize the pattern even before opening the email. Still, sometimes I accept, because the account doesn't wait for the investigation to finish. The difference is that now I know exactly how far I can go before becoming a disposable piece in the game of those who use refrigerated trucks to move the kind of cargo that doesn't show up in any system. And every time I cross through Laredo again and see the warehouses lined up along the border, I remember the first detour and the silver pickup truck parked in the dark, just watching. That trip was a test, not a main operation. They were measuring what kind of driver I was. And the fact that no one has tried to silence me to this day means that I'm still useful to someone, even without knowing which side of the border that someone actually works on. When the federal agents knocked on the cab door, the truck still smelled of the new plastic from the cargo I'd unloaded 2 days earlier. I'd seen heavy roadblocks before, been searched by a lost county sheriff, but I'd never faced 3 agents in tactical vests calling me by my full name, demanding I show my hands as if I were the thief. My first feeling wasn't guilt. It was emptiness. If there was anyone there who truly had no idea what was going on, it was the guy in the coffee-stained plaid shirt, highway red eyes, driving a fully financed Peterbilt in a freight job that seemed like just another one among many. Me, the driver who had accepted the easiest load of the week because diesel waits for no one. 3 days earlier, I was in Oklahoma City, at some random freight yard. I had just unloaded auto parts in the industrial area and was hunting for a return freight job. Anything that would get me out of there that day and point the cab toward Texas. Being empty that Tuesday meant throwing away money I didn't have. The freight appeared on the app as if someone had read my mind. Palletized cargo, well paid, direct route, origin, distribution warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Destination, warehouse in Amarillo, Texas Panhandle. Generic description, various household appliances. The only unusual thing was a comment in capital letters. Do not stop at intermediate weighings, route already cleared. I had seen large shippers who had agreements with the state to avoid being held up at full weighbridges. In my mind, that only meant speed and avoided bureaucracy. I agreed to the freight without thinking too much, started the engine and let the deep rumble of the diesel drown out any desire to ask more questions. The original warehouse was located at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by barbed wire and a makeshift gate made of thick chain. Nothing fancy, no sign of a well-known company, just a brick building with 2 loading docks and an office with a small window and dirty tinted glass. Truck drivers learn to read a place by its smell, and this place smelled of money that doesn't like to be seen. I pulled up to the designated dock and handed the paperwork to a thin guy in an orange vest with no name on his badge. He checked the waybill number hurriedly, barely glancing at me. Inside, 2 forklift operators were already lining up pallets wrapped in clear plastic film, neatly stacked white boxes all with barcodes. While the truck was filling up, I noticed a detail that I jotted down in my head, purely reflexively. Instead of the standard seal of a large company, they handed me a simple metal seal, inside a brown envelope, already noted on the delivery note. The guy in the vest himself put it on, stamped the number on the stub, and gave me back the copy. Just a curt, "It's cleared," and the hurried manner of someone who wants the truck out of there as soon as possible. I left Oklahoma City via the ring road, took the interstate, and let the city fade into the distance. The route to Amarillo was always the same. Straight asphalt, repetitive signs, gas stations promising fresh coffee, motels swearing clean beds. The sun rose, the cabin heated up, and I turned the air conditioning to maximum, letting the autopilot take care of the straight line while my mind raced after installments and the maintenance I'd been putting off. It was at that moment, with my mind elsewhere, that I received the first strange message on the app. Not from the broker, but from an internal system number without a name. The subject line had my freight code. The text told me to avoid very busy truck stops, suggested 2 smaller truck stops along the way, and ended with a clean sentence without emojis. "Keep the seal intact. Any alteration invalidates the payment." That brought a tired half-smile to my face. I saw companies afraid of cargo theft every day. Faced with so much creativity, the obsession with the seal seemed normal. My job was different: to get from point A to point B, sign for the delivery, and move on. Around noon, I stopped at one of the suggested truck stops. Small place, old gas pump, small restaurant. I filled up, ate a hamburger that had been sitting on the grill for too long, used the bathroom, and on the way back I took a quick look at the truck. The seal was tight. The cargo box was silent. The hot wind was kicking up dust under the axles. For a second, that feeling that something was wrong almost came to mind. But truckers who listen too much to their intuition and too little to their bank balance end up refusing well-paying freight. I climbed back in, pulled the door, engaged the gear, and let the asphalt swallow the doubt with the sound of the tires. The afternoon slipped by uneventfully until the sky began to change color near the Texas border. Gas station flags swaying crookedly, gasoline billboards becoming rarer, that feeling that the further you go, the fewer witnesses there are if something goes wrong. The tank was still full, so I drove straight through, the radio crackling with old rock music. The first concrete sign that the trip had an owner appeared in the form of a black Dodge, with tinted windows, which pulled up alongside my truck for a few seconds, as if checking the license plate, and then backed up behind me. It wasn't a patrol car. It wasn't a farmer's pickup truck. It stayed there, too close to be a coincidence, too far away to be just haste. I know the dance of the road. Whoever wants to intimidate a truck arrives breathless, flashes their high beams, makes a stupid overtaking maneuver. Not that car. It maintained a calculated distance, as if it were observing a test. When it finally overtook me, it did so slowly, without haste. At a glance, I saw a discreet antenna on the roof and a radio mount on the dashboard. It looked like an off-duty police officer or someone accustomed to driving unnoticed. I couldn't get it out of my head until the sign for the next way station appeared on the side of the highway. Way station 1 mile. The phrase from the message about avoiding way stations lit up inside me as if someone had switched on a light bulb. Except at that moment the station lights were on, showing all the commercials. Ignoring it wasn't an option. I entered the ramp along with other trucks, tires vibrating on the concrete strip. The black Dodge drove straight past the interstate and disappeared on the horizon as if the way station didn't exist. That small detail deepened the feeling that someone, besides me, had a great interest in that cargo. At the weigh-in, everything seemed too normal. Weight within the limit, axles perfectly aligned, documentation in order. The officer barely looked up from the monitor, signaled to proceed, and in a few minutes I was back on the track, with the uncomfortable certainty that if something was wrong, it wasn't a number, it wasn't an excess weight, it wasn't something that appeared on a computer screen. I arrived in Amarillo in the early evening, the sky turning a dirty orange and a cold wind whipping dust through the parking lot of my destination warehouse. The address led me to a large complex, full of numbered docks, bright spotlights, and trucks coming and going. I checked in at the gate and handed the paperwork to the security guard. He checked the license plate, noted the time, and went to the back to check the seal. He lowered his head, brought his face closer, and frowned. He asked me to wait a minute, went back into the guardhouse with the documents in his hand, and started talking on the phone. He looked at my truck as if trying to decide whether he was dealing with a system error or a problem that would require a report. When he returned, he told me to go to Dock 12. He said the receiving staff would be watching the opening of the cargo container. It wasn't common, but it wasn't entirely out of the ordinary either. Sometimes companies that are taking losses start keeping a close eye on things. I pulled up to the dock, felt the vehicle touch the rubber seal, and pulled the parking brake. 2 employees appeared with clipboards. Behind them, a man in a light-colored dress shirt without a name tag. The seal was photographed, checked, and noted. When they cut the metal with pliers, the snap was louder than necessary. The door opened, the smell of plastic and cardboard filled the air, and I saw up close for the first time the boxes without logos, only with generic codes. The pallets started to come out slowly, the forklift beeping. Everything was fine until a box slipped slightly, gave way on the side, and tore a hole in the cardboard. Instead of a stereo or microwave, what appeared was electronic equipment crudely packaged, still with labels from another retail chain stuck underneath a new label. Nobody said anything for the first few seconds. One of the employees put down his clipboard. The man in the dress shirt made a curt gesture ordering everyone to stop, and the silence in the warehouse seemed to weigh more than the whole scene. In less than half an hour, internal security, management, and local police were already surrounding my truck, and those anonymous boxes had a name: stolen cargo. At the police station, the word was used bluntly. They explained that 2 days earlier, an identical shipment of electronics had been hijacked on a secondary highway, the driver overpowered, and the truck abandoned empty. The description of the boxes, the palletization, the covered labels matched what they had taken from my truck. The difference was that this time, someone had thought it a good idea to have the merchandise cross the state using a clean driver. I became, at the same time, the most disposable and most useful piece in the game. No record, no connection to a gang, no history of involvement in a scheme. My only connection to it was a digital freight contract made through a broker that, they later discovered, was a fake registration on top of a shell company opened a few months earlier. A shell used to broker trips paid above average for those desperate enough not to ask questions. Then came the hours of interrogation in a cold room. They wanted to know who attended to me at the warehouse, what time I arrived, how many forklifts I saw, what trucks were nearby, how many messages I received on the app where I parked, if I noticed anyone following me. The black Dodge came back vividly to my memory, from the antenna on the roof to the way it drove straight past the way station. Every detail I had dismissed as mere noise became a piece of the puzzle. I spent days stuck in Amarillo, staying in a cheap motel at the disposal of the investigation. I lost other freight jobs. I lost money. I became just a number in a legal case. The truck was only released after photographs, reports, and inspections of every compartment. When I finally sat back in the driver's seat and looked at the empty cargo area in the rearview mirror, I didn't feel relief. I felt like a piece of the last bit of naivete I had left had been ripped away. Today, whenever a freight job appears with a price that seems too good to be true, a dubious origin and strange requirements, I look twice. Not out of fear of a gun pointed at me by the side of the road. That risk comes with the package when you choose to live off the highway. I look twice because I've discovered that the type of crime that almost buried my career doesn't shout, doesn't make noise, doesn't show its face. It travels silently, wrapped in cardboard without a logo, hidden inside its own trunk. The truth is, on that Tuesday, I was the last to know I was carrying stolen goods. And for someone who spends their life traveling from state to state, finding out later is almost as dangerous as knowing too much from the start.